Chapter 15. A Covenant. From the battle with the Elamites, Abram returned once more to Shechem, and offered sacrifices to the Eternal. The servants of his had some respite from their battle wounds before returning to their work. War was an awful business, and Abram hoped in vain that he would not have to be put to war yet again. For the time being, however, there seemed to be peace in the land. The Amorites returned to their lands, and Abram returned to his flocks and his tents. So the months went on, and life went on as it usually did in Canaan. The endless search for water, and the troubles of the flocks and herds. The servants married and had children, whose unions were officiated by Abram. Yet while this continued, Abram's own heart was stricken with grief. Chieftains, princes, shepherds, and merchants in the marketplaces, from Lisha to Beersheba, all spoke of Abram in such a manner. Even those who thought well of him would chuckle about how his God blessed him in all things, and yet left him as a sterile old mule. Some time later, when Abram's sewn bracelet had 70 beads of cloth upon it, he was placing the goat upon the altar outside of Shechem for the evening sacrifice. The sun was halfway down in the western sky, and the heavens above were turning a shade of indigo. Brilliant specks of light began to twinkle here and there, as the second heavenly body from the sun heralded the coming of night. In this state, Abram knelt by the altar, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. His head swayed back and forth, and the flames of the fire crackled and smoked. Suddenly his vision became clear, and he saw Metatron standing on the right hand of the stone altar.
"Fear not, Abram, son of Terah,"
the angel said to him.
"The Most High is your shield, and your exceeding great reward."
Abram lifted his head, and opened his heart before the angel, speaking in a soft, wearied tone of voice, one that had been broken and beaten by years of the world and its mockery. "Lord," he said, "what shall the Eternal give me, seeing I go childless? Behold, all the days of my life I have faithfully followed the Eternal's commands. I have made offerings every year, and twice every day, of the best sheep and goats of my flock. I have not ceased to tell those whose paths have crossed mine of the Eternal God. Yea, my entire household knows of him. And yet I am made the mockery of the heathen nations. The Eternal promised me that my seed should inherit this land, and behold, he has given me no seed. Shall my servant Eliezer the Damascene be my heir? For he is a servant of my own house, a good and faithful servant, better than 10 sons. Let him be my heir, and raise up seed to thy glory."
"Eliezer shall not be your heir, Abram,"
Metatron answered.
"Your heir shall be a son that shall come forth from thine own bowels."
Metatron knelt beside Abram, and looked into his eyes.
"Behold, it is evening. You have watched the stars and used them to guide you in your wanderings. Look now towards heaven.
He gestured upward with his finger.
Count the stars, if you can."
Abram looked up, and shook his head. "There are so many. So many. Too many to count."
"So shall it be for thy seed, Abram, son of Terah,"
Metatron replied. Abram stammered, looking up at the stars, and then back to the angel. Metatron was now standing upright and looking down upon him. I believe," Abram replied. "May the Eternal help my unbelief, for I am an old man, and a sterile old mule, as they call me."
"Thus saith the Most High, the maker of heaven and earth,"
Metatron announced.
"I, the Almighty, am thy God. I delivered you from the fire of Nimrod, and brought you out of Ur-Chaldim, to give you this land as your inheritance."
"But how shall I know that I shall inherit it?" Abram asked eagerly. There was a solemn rumble, as of distant thunder. Metatron closed his eyes and when he opened them, he spoke slowly and carefully.
The Almighty demands a sacrifice of you,
he said grimly.
Take for him a heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat of 3 years old, a ram of 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, and offer them for a burnt offering upon this altar. Divide the beasts in two in the midst thereof, and lay each piece against each other, but do not divide the birds.
Abram nodded and took off in the direction of the flocks. His servants did not stop him, for they were amazed at his personage. He seemed to be gazing upward as he walked, and yet did not trip over a single stone. When he came to the flock, he took the ones he was instructed, and no strength, whether of man or beast, could force his hands against his purpose. Eleazar was called forth, for the shepherds feared that their master was stricken by a heat stroke and lost his mind. Strong though he was, and having recovered from the blow he suffered in battle, he could not turn his master from his task. For a moment his hand passed over his master's mouth, and saw that no breath came from his lips. Yet he moved, and his hands were warm like the body of a living man, and not one of the dead. Slowly Abram returned to the altar, leading in his hands the rope bit of the heifer in one hand, and the ram and the goat in the other. The wooden cages of the pigeon and dove were upon the heifer's back. There was not enough room on the small altar for all the beasts, so Abram placed them before the altar. Rather than let the beasts see the knife and so bring them to fright, he would bring the animal behind the altar out of sight of the others, and slit its throat as humanely as possible. One by one, the larger beasts were slain, and the birds he removed from their cages and broke their necks swiftly. Now came the difficult part. Cutting through a whole cow, even a young one, was often the task of 2 or more, and not one. Yet he had with him, perhaps, a strength beyond strength, and so began hacking apart the heifer's body down the middle, severing flesh and sinew apart with the blade of the knife. From neck to flanks the heifer was divided, allowing for ease of separating the spine and breaking in two. With a loud, sickeningly satisfying crack, the spine was broken, and the 2 halves of the cow were pulled apart. Abram laid them opposite each other on the ground, then went to the goat and began the process again. Based on sheer size, this was less difficult than the heifer. Once this was cut down the middle as well, he placed the 2 pieces opposite each other, even as he did the heifer. No sooner had he assayed himself of the ram, but he began to hear the distant cawing of birds of prey. Still enraptured in the vision as he was, he noticed them little, but hacked into the flesh of the ram. Bit by bit, cut by cut, he severed the ram as he had the other beasts, and laid them opposite each other. With hands that were now almost completely colored red, Abram took the bodies of the dove and pigeon, and set them among the severed beasts, but did not raise his knife against them. He rose up from the carnage, looking upward into the sky. Metatron was nowhere to be seen. "I have done as you asked, eternal God," Abram pleaded. "Behold, the beasts lie in pieces before me, even as you have commanded. Will you show me the sign whereby I shall know that I shall inherit the land?" As if in mockery of Abram's prayer, the vultures began to circle overhead. By and by they began to descend, the smell of flesh and blood burning in their nostrils. Abram put down his knife and took up the staff, which he had placed against the altar when the command had been given him. One of the black-winged fowl descended like a watcher upon Mount Senir to feast upon the heifer's corpse. "Back!" Abram ordered, swinging the staff at the vulture. Another one came down upon the ram. Abram swung his staff at the bird, who took a step away and cawed defiantly at Abram. "Back!" he demanded. 3 more came down for the feast, beating their black wings as they alighted upon the carcasses on the ground. Abram swung the staff back and forth at them, trying to push them away. "Ah!" Abram shouted, as one tried to peck at him. Back, I say! It took all his strength to shoo away just one of them, and there were now 5 crowding around him. With a swing of his staff and loud cries, he sent away another one. The head of his staff connected with the body of the 3rd vulture, who hobbled away before taking wing and departing for unguarded meats. The other 2, meanwhile, were still looking oddly at the human, shoving them away from what they believed was a fair meal. But Abram persisted, though he felt the strength that had moved him starting to ebb out of his body. Every swing of his staff became harder and harder, as though he were swinging the bole of a young tree. His eyes grew heavy, and he sank to his knees, his hands and forearms covered in blood, and his body weary beyond belief. With one last desperate swing of his hands, he drove away the last 2 buzzards before falling backwards onto the ground. Suddenly he was awake again. He looked up into the sky and saw nothing. No stars, no sun, no moon. His heart was racing beneath his breast, and he reached out with his hand to push himself up onto his feet. He could see nothing. Or perhaps the darkness had always been, and his eyes had never beheld it before. But this darkness was deeper than night. There was something about this darkness, something worse than the shadow of night. He reached out his hand and felt the cool, vaporous smoke, blacker than the darkest night. This darkness could be felt.
Abram, son of Terra.
The voice of Metatron resounding from somewhere in the darkness. It sounded deeper, louder, and resonated so greatly that Abram's ears hurt merely to hear the voice, yet it filled him with dread and awe to hear it just the same.
The Most High has given you a glimpse of what shall come to pass.
The voice continued.
As a sign that you shall inherit this land.
Suddenly, out of the darkness, Abram thought he saw figures and shapes of people, like gray smoke, ephemeral and without substance. Slowly the shapes turned and changed again into forms more solid, and Abram saw an old man and an old woman huddled together over a tiny bundle of cloth.
Know of a surety that thy people shall be strangers in a land that is not theirs.
The voice said.
And they shall serve them and be afflicted 400 years.
Then the vision shifted, and he saw a flash of red. 10 young men standing before great armies, and a limping old man throwing himself upon the shoulders of a prince of Mizraim. Again the vision shifted, and he saw rows and rows of men bowed beneath heavy burdens, and he heard the crack of the whip that urged them on with their dull, loathsome task. Suddenly there appeared a man standing up from among the rows of men, and he bore in his hand the staff of Abram. Even as he rose up, the others around him dropped their burdens, and picked up gold in great number.
And also the Most High will judge that nation whom they shall serve, and afterward shall they come out with great substance.
When will this happen? Abram asked. Will it be in my time?
No, for thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace.
The voice replied.
And be buried in a good old age.
Abram saw the scene shift. He saw an old man being led by a young child under the shade of a tent. The old man lay down to rest under the tent and never rose again. Then the scene shifted, and Abram saw the other man leading the multitude of the slaves, and his face was shining like the sun.
But in the 4th generation thy seed shall come to this land again.
The voice said.
For the iniquity of the Elamites is not yet full.
Once again the image shifted, and Abram saw the multitudes setting down in tents. But then something terrible was happening. They began to build images for themselves, and to slay each other. Then he saw the heifer rise out of the darkness. Beneath he saw the multitudes bowed down once again, being taken away into the east as slaves once more. Suddenly the vision shifted, and he saw a great city straddling the two rivers. But a great host had stopped the river, and so climbed under the walls of that city and set it to fire. As the smoke rose up, the heifer was cut in two. Then he saw a figure standing beneath the flash of red, and pointing towards the multitudes, as though he demanded for their deaths. Above this man he saw the ram, pushing with its horns to the west, to the north, and to the south, so that nothing might stand before him. Then the scene shifted, and he saw a host of horsemen pursue a single man in a chariot, and the ram also was sundered in two. Now the scene shifted, and the goat came from the west, and Abram saw the multitude standing before one who built up a statue and demanded that they bow before it. Then several scenes passed quickly, in which Abram saw the multitude standing up before the armies of that one man, and a great battle at sea. Then a more amazing thing happened. As Abram looked on, he saw the multitudes gathered upon the slopes of a mountain somewhere in the north. On the top of that mountain there stood the likeness of a man, above whom floated the dove, whole and unbroken, who was speaking to those gathered about him. Then the man was taken up by armed men and hanged upon a tree. Then he was taken down and placed in the earth. Suddenly the image shone, and the man rose up, alive once more. Abram let out a laugh, clasping his hands against his mouth in gladness. Suddenly the darkness subsided, and the stars appeared once more in the night sky. Abram found himself lying on the ground, with the altar and the animals still around him. He rose up, a smile on his face at the image that had just gone through his mind. Then there was a burst of brilliant, ominous red light, as 3 tongues of fire ignited, rising from the midst of the pieces of the animals. Again, he heard the voice speaking again, the voice of Metatron magnified beyond the ability to bear it.
Unto your seed the Almighty has given this land, from the river of Mizraim to the river Perat, the land of the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Dryads, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
The fire subsided, leaving Abram in the darkness of the night. He seemed yet to have just woken up from a dream. In his mind, weary though it was with sleep, he pondered what he had just seen. The eternal God had made a covenant with him, just as he had made with the chieftains of the Amorites and his nephew Lot. But it was not a covenant like their fashion. The Eternal asked nothing of Abram, but merely promised him that this land would be his. Into his mind came the memory of the covenant of the rainbow. No matter what would happen, the Eternal would not destroy the world with a flood of water. That he had no stipulations on him was beyond Abram's comprehension. Yet again, what could he possibly do that the Eternal would need? He was, after all, the creator, possessor, and sustainer of heaven and earth. Anything he might do would be too small and insignificant for one so great. And yet he had made a covenant with him, asking nothing of him, but only to believe. The story continues in chapter 16.